Man, from his beginning, has demonstrated a natural inclination towards explaining the existence of the universe and the purpose of his being. Belief systems were developed in an attempt to understand the superhuman or supernatural controlling power or powers that existed in the world and ultimately in his personal life. Oftentimes motivated out of fear, man would conduct rituals or services to curry the favor and to acknowledge the presence of these higher powers. Man was viewed as the creation of the spiritual or divine presence who had controlling destiny over all living things. Fundamental sets of beliefs, practices, and traditions, generally agreed upon by a group of people, were formed in an attempt to understand the creation of the universe and the purpose of man. Devotional and ritualistic observances would be conducted to honor or to appease this superior presence. Quite oftentimes, a moral code governing human behavior would be established. Those keeping within its boundaries could earn goodness or grace with this power or God, and oftentimes the promise of everlasting life for a faithful style of living. These practices translated into a diversity of beliefs, worship styles, sects, cults, churches, denominations, and religions. They were generally headed by a spiritual leader who mentored fellow members in their relationship with a god or multiple gods. These were the roots or foundation of present-day religions around the world. The 4,200 or more religions that have existed throughout time can basically be divided into three distinct styles. The first, the polytheistic religions, believed that there were multiple deities or a pantheon of gods and goddesses. Ancient cultures oftentimes practiced these beliefs, with separate gods overseeing such things as the weather, the harvest, love, and fertility. These gods generally took on human qualities and functioned on a continuum of power, with some being more influential than others. Power struggles were not uncommon amongst these deities. The ancient Greeks and Roman religions served as perfect examples. These gods or goddesses had their own domain of power, sphere of influence, and religious rituals dedicated to them. Zeus was considered by the Greeks to be the most powerful. Hades, the god of the underworld, Poseidon, the god of the seas, Aphrodite, the goddess of love, Athena, the goddess of wisdom, courage, and inspiration, and Apollo, the god of music, art, and poetry, serve as examples. The pantheistic religious style premises that the universe and nature is the totality of everything and is identical to God. Everything in nature encompasses God. There is not one inseparable or personal being. Pantheism is the polar opposite of atheism, which says there is no God. Within this belief, all reality is identical to God. The early African tribal and American Indian practices and rituals serve as example of this style of worship. This belief system would probably support the Big Bang Theory of today. The third major religious system would be that of monotheism. This style of belief can be traced back to Abraham in the year 2000 BC. God, through the next 2,000 years, revealed himself to Abraham and his descendants. He promised posterity to his lineage and land on which to establish a church. The three contemporary major monotheistic traditions of today, although they vary in their interpretation of the importance of the family of Abraham and Jesus Christ are all significantly influenced and dependent upon what transpired between the coming of Abraham and the birth of Christ. The Christian tradition believes that Abraham and his descendants struggled and paved the way for the birth of Christ and nearly 2,000 years of Christianity. Joseph, although Mary conceived and delivered Jesus as a virgin, was a descendant of Abraham and was the earthly father of Jesus. Jesus is viewed as the Son of God and one of the three natures of God in the Trinitarian doctrine. This is certainly not accepted by either the Islamic or Judaic tradition. The Islamic tradition and its Muslim members believe that Muhammad was a descendant of Abraham and, like Jesus, a mortal man and messenger and prophet of God. He is considered the last prophet sent by God or Allah. Muhammad is credited with bringing back and restoring the monotheistic focus of their religion. Judaism is one of the oldest monotheistic religions, predating Christianity by at least 2,000 years. Abraham and his offspring were promised a great nation by God. He is considered the first patriarch of the Jewish people. Jesus is viewed as a false Messiah and an ordinary man who spoke out against the Roman Empire. He is not viewed as the Son of God or as the Messiah foretold by prophecy. Judaism is based on a relationship with God through his covenant made with the children of Israel. Two major events which strongly influenced the history of the church within Europe and subsequently the church history within the Americas. The birth of Christ in the time after his death obviously brought about the formation of Christianity and particularly the Roman Catholic Church. Several years later, during the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation would greatly alter the direction of religious worship within Europe. Reform efforts within the Catholic Church began as early as the 14th and 15th centuries. The teachings of Jan Hus, or pronounced Jan Hus, a Czech priest and reformer, as well as those of John Wycliffe, an English scholar, theologian, reformer, and teacher at Oxford University, contributed to the growing unrest regarding the Catholic Church. The teachings of Hus strongly influenced the emerging national states in Europe. Wycliffe strongly challenged the papacy and even accused the Pope of being an antichrist, attempting to elevate himself to a position which only belonged to God. Both men were accused of heresy by the Catholic Church. Hus was burnt at the stake. Wycliffe died of natural causes, but years later his body was ordered exhumed and burnt. Times are changing in Europe. The old medieval feudalistic landowning and social system is disappearing, and the rise of independent national states is emerging. A renaissance is transpiring during the 14th, 15th, and 16th century, with a great revival in the arts, literature, and learning. People are now beginning to question traditional thinking. Johannes Gutenberg has invented the printing press, and with its introduction, communication across Europe has significantly improved. People gain more exposure and input to their world. The Western Schism has begun to erode the faith in the papacy. The Curia, the administrative body of the Catholic Church, is being questioned and challenged about their policy, especially the lucrative sale of offices within the church hierarchy. This is the world that Martin Luther and other Catholic priests, scholars, and theologians were living in. The core motivation of the Protestant Reformation, or more accurately stated, the Protestant Reformation, was theologically or church-based. Luther and other Catholic Church reformers were becoming increasingly disgruntled with the Roman Catholic Church of the 16th century. Their attempt was to peaceably transform a failing church and purge the ecclesiastical malpractices in its doctrines. Most, if not all, attempts fell on deaf ears. Luther nailed the 95 Theses on the power and efficacy of indulgences on the Wittenberg church door on October 31st, 1517. This was the true beginning of the Reformation movement. The practice of selling indulgences for both the living and the dead throughout Europe by agents of the church was assailed. These indulgences were purported to lessen time spent by souls in purgatory. Theologically, this practice negated the concept and need for forgiveness through God. It was also pointed out that these sales were being utilized to partially fund the building of St. Peter's Basilica. Luther's documents either included or were extended to include the authority of the Pope, the role of Mary within the Church, the concept of saints and the intercession of saints, the buying and selling of ecclesiastical offices, celibacy, and the monastic life. Luther instead, in his belief system, stressed the personal discovery of Jesus and salvation by faith alone. He defined the papacy as an antichrist, stating that the Pope was utilizing the prophecies of the Bible in an attempt to become godlike. He pointed out also that the selling of indulgences by Pope Leo X was benefiting the church coffers. The hypocrisy of Pope Alexander VI advocating celibacy while fathering 7 children was certainly stressed. The Pope reacted quickly, condemning the Reform movement and excommunicating Luther. A counter-movement was initiated by the Catholic Church at the Council of Trent. This meeting established the Society of Jesus, better known as the Jesuits. Although this group was not designed for this purpose, it strongly attempted to negate the Reformation movement. The reality was, however, that the effects of the movement were well underway and wouldn't be deterred. England, as early as 1530, under Henry VIII, broke with the Catholic Church for political more than religious reasons. In 1547, they completely separated from papal authority. The religious map of Europe was changed forever. Germany and the Baltic and Scandinavian countries became predominantly Lutheran. Southern Europe remained the stronghold of the Catholic faith. For over 100 years, Central Europe would become a battleground of devastating religious wars. In 1648, the Peace of Westphalia ended the 30 Years' War and the strife in Central Europe, as well as the Reform period. The history of the Reformation and religious movements in England is highly entwined with the religious happenings within New England and later within our community. The Pilgrims, Puritans, or Separatists journeyed to the American shores, seeking not only a new land, but also the opportunity for freedom of religion. This is where our community's religious history really begins. The real beginning of religion within the area that would eventually become Bristol, started in 1742. Religion was very important to the early settlers, but traveling back to Farmington for the obligatory all-day Sabbath services was extremely difficult, especially in the depths of night, during hostile weather conditions, and over rough Indian trails. A small group of settlers approached the General Court of Connecticut, petitioning that they be permitted to hold services in their home for 6 months each year. They also stated that their long-term goal was to become a separate ecclesiastical society. The Assembly granted the request. The geographic center of the area, which would become known as the Federal Hill Green, was selected for construction of their first church or meeting house. The present church, their third, was built in 1832. The New Cambridge Ecclesiastical Society, which became known as Bristol, was established in 1744. The Congregational Church became the established religion in the area. Other religious groups were obligated to pay taxes to them in order to become citizens and to vote. The Congregational Church had a theocracy form of government. Church and government were one and the same. This was the practice of the times. A small group of dissenters, loyal to the Anglican Church of England, however, when the strict Puritan-style pastor, Samuel Newell, was hired by the Congregationalists, withdrew in 1747 and established a small Episcopal church on the opposite side of the Federal Hill Green. These two religions coexisted in a semi-harmonious relationship. The Episcopals were eventually exempt from the taxation. However, when the War of Independence broke out, being loyal to the King of England, they were soon vilified, harassed, persecuted, and even feared for their lives. They were forced to flee to the Chippens Hill area and to Torrey's Den, leaving behind their small church. It took nearly 50 years for them to return to the Bristol area in 1834. The Episcopals, after the conclusion of the Revolutionary War, began to recover within the community from their former connection with the Church of England and their opposition to the War for Independence. Bishop Samuel Seabury was consecrated and assisted in the building of a strictly American Episcopal church, similar in doctrine and ritual, but totally independent of the Church of England. This greatly assisted in the gaining of acceptance within the newly formed country. The Trinity Church Society was incorporated in 1834 and purchased land at the intersection of Maple and Summer Streets. Until it could complete the building of a small church, the Congregational Church offered them use of the parish house for services. After completion of their small church, they remained here from 1835 to 1863, when they built a larger church on the east side of Main Street, where the Linstead block stood at the corner of Prospect Street. In 1889, the railroad in town made extensive changes to improve the railroad crossing. The Trinity Church sold the Main Street property and moved their building to High Street, directly across from the current Bristol Public Library. This church was destroyed by fire in 1945. Land became available on Summer Street, where the final Trinity Church was built. It was dedicated in 1949. They remained there for 60 years until a major conflict arose in 2008 with the installation of a gay bishop. Trinity Church, along with others, strongly objected to this as being theologically improper and strongly conflicted with the Connecticut hierarchy. Threatened by a lawsuit by the Episcopal Diocese of Connecticut, they vacated their building. Some members are now parishioners of an out-of-town church, the Holy Trinity Anglican Church, which is affiliated with the Convocation of Anglicans of North America. It would appear that this is somewhat ironic, in that during the Revolutionary days, the Episcopal Church was seen as the more liberal of the churches. The Baptist religion, as a church, with the exception of the Congregationalists, has the oldest continuous history in Connecticut. The Baptist Church of Bristol had its beginning in 1791, when members from the Baptist societies in Bristol, Wolcott, and Plymouth united to organize a church. Services were held to begin with in the outskirts of each of these communities and continued until 1802. The membership of this congregation was a rather scattered and feeble sort, being unable to attract the wealthy or important members of their communities. Early records of this church are replete in stories of witchcraft, or at least a curious connection with supernatural powers. It appears that these happenings began when a divinity student named King came to town to study with Elder Wildman. Stories of illuminated ghosts, people being tormented or suffering burns or being demonically possessed were prominent. Even Elder Wildman, after attempting unsuccessfully to rid a young lady of her afflictions, fell victim to grievous torment and pain. Deacon Dutton's oxen was ripped to shreds before his eyes after he expressed disbelief in the power of evil spirits. On King's departure, the activities of the evil spirit seemed to disappear. Today's Witches Rock Road is named after the area where most of the Baptists lived and where much of this activity transpired. Starting in 1802, the church moved to Bristol, and at various times, two smaller churches were built in the vicinity of West Street and School Street. In 1880, a large brick church was constructed on the corner of School and Church Street. In 1919, the church was significantly damaged by a fire, and the organ was completely destroyed. By 1923, the congregation considered the location unsuitable because of the changing complexion of the neighborhood, with its noise, dust, and congested highway. The Bristol Baptist Church initiated the sale of the church. The Connecticut State Baptist Convention agreed to lease the facility, but the heirs of the donor strongly objected. A court case ensued. The state Supreme Court ruled in favor of the sale. By the time the decision was rendered, the opportunity to sell had passed. To this day, the location remains the same. In 1969, the old church sanctuary was taken down, and the present church constructed and dedicated in 1970. In 1910, 29 members left the Bristol Baptist Church to form the Swedish Baptist Church, later known as the Goodwin Street Baptist Church and now the Grace Baptist Church. The history of the present-day Prospect United Methodist Church began in 1834, the same year that the Trinity Episcopal Church was established. Services were first held in a one-room schoolhouse or in private dwellings. Methodism was looked upon unfavorably, and there was a strong and persistent resistance to this religion and to the purchase of land on which to construct the church. When a piece of land became available, the committee interrupted the dinner of Justice Tracy Peck, who executed the necessary legal documents. They feared without this quick movement, their enemies might stop the sale. The purchased land was on West Street, where the Advent Christian Church stands today. A winter revival of 1857 and 1858 had a significant impact on the growth of the Prospect Methodist Church, but probably more important, brought John Humphrey Sessions into membership. Humphrey and his sons, John H. Jr. and William E. Sessions, were significant contributors to the church and the community. As their business fortunes increased, so did their generosity to the church. A brick church was built on Summer Street. It needed to be enlarged in 1888. In 1893, Sessions, at his own expense, erected the present granite church that was added to the original structure. It was dedicated in 1894. The church throughout the years, because of affiliations, has been named the Methodist Episcopal Church, the Prospect Methodist Episcopal Church, and currently the Prospect United Methodist Church. One pastor, Reverend Laverius Dorchester, spearheaded the movement to construct the Bristol Hospital. He was the first president of this organization. One interesting episode concerned John Humphrey Sessions. Although he was a major benefactor of the Prospect Church and also president of the Bristol and Plainville Tramway Company, Pastor Charles Buck railed against the Tramway Company for its services to lake compounds on Sunday as being anti-religious. Sessions resigned as president after hearing the admonitions by his pastor. William E. Sessions, in 1887, at his own personal expense, built the Mount Hope Chapel on Hill Street in the Chippens Hill area. This was utilized to service the religious needs of people in this area, especially people vacationing there during the summertime. The minister from Prospect Methodist would conduct these services. Sessions often personally drove him there in his horse and buggy, and eventually his car. This church became the first Michael spiritualist church, and today is the Church of the Eternal Life, a Wiccan church. The Forestville Methodist Episcopal Church was organized in 1855. Members had previously traveled to Bristol to attend worship services. Before a church was built, services were held either outdoors, at member homes, or at Demings Hall at the corner of Washington Street and Stafford Avenue. In 1863, the former Methodist Church on Maple Street was purchased and moved to Forestville. It was dedicated a year later. In May of 1900, this edifice was struck by lightning and completely burnt to the ground. William E. Sessions contributed significantly to the rebuilding of this church. The design was to resemble a miniature Prospect Methodist church. The cornerstone was laid in September, and the church was dedicated in December of the same year. Amazingly, at this time, the church was debt-free due to the generosity of William E. Sessions. The Advent Christian Church was organized in 1858. Its membership was increased around 1879 when the Methodist Episcopal Church moved to Summer Street. A number of the members were displeased with this move, having grown accustomed to traveling to and worshiping at their North Side Church. They withdrew and joined the Adventist Church. This church leased and then purchased the former Methodist Episcopal Church. In 1890, this church burnt to the ground, and the present edifice was constructed on the same spot. The history of the Roman Catholic religion in Bristol can rightfully be traced back to the Irish, who were the first large group of immigrants to reach our shores. They were fleeing the potato famine and pestilence of the years 1847 to 1852. 1 million of their fellow citizens in a country of 8 millions died during this period. Another million left to enter the United States. Upon their arrival, many of these families settled in an area on Stafford Avenue near the Burlington town line called Skibbereen, after an Irish community. They would, for years, become laborers at the highly productive copper mines in this area. As the work at the copper mines slowed down and eventually closed in 1857, they transitioned to become factory workers in Bristol's growing industrial economy. Others would become employed by the railroad that was extending through Forestville and Bristol during the early 1850s. Religion was of major significance within their lives. Reverend Luke Daly of St. Mary's Church in New Britain began hearing confessions and conducting services on a monthly basis. These services were held at either laborers' homes or in mine buildings. The Irish felt they could not live worthily and happily without the worship of their God. When mine officials attempted to restrict their time utilized for religious services, the Irish workers and their families conducted the first strike in Bristol until privileges were restored. As the Irish transitioned out into the greater community, and as more Irish immigrants arrived, a need for a Catholic church became evident. In 1855, led by Reverend Daly, Catholics purchased a piece of land on the east side of the Federal Hill Green. A small wooden church was erected. Reverend Michael Rodden became the first resident pastor until 1901, with the exception of 4 years when he took a leave of absence for health reasons. St. Joseph remained a mission of St. Mary's Church until 1864, when it became a separate parish. At this time, St. Joseph's conducted mission churches in Farmington, Plainville, Terryville, Thomaston, and Watertown. Each would become independent parishes. The Catholic Church in town appeared to have a harmonious relationship with other denominations, although their creeds might differ. The relationship between Reverend Rodden and Dr. Reverend Leverett Griggs of the First Congregational Church probably had a significant influence on this harmony. A parochial school, rectory, and convent were all constructed in 1902. With a tremendous growth in their church population, a new church was needed. The magnificent granite structure of English Gothic style with 2 striking exterior towers was dedicated on August 9, 1925. St. Joseph's not only was the mother church for several out-of-town churches, but also found it necessary in 1891 to split their parish and form a Forestville mission church. From a meager beginning of 200 members, they had climbed to an enrollment of 3,000 as immigrants from Europe continued to arrive. St. Matthew's would be a mission church of Our Lady of Mercy in Plainville. Reverend Rodden, previous to this, starting in 1891, because of the numbers and difficulty for parishioners to travel, he would take a buggy trip to the village and say Mass at the first Forestville firehouse. The selection of the location became a matter of deep concern within the village. One party wanted it on the Spellman property on Washington Street. The other wanted it on Church Avenue. This site was selected against the architect's wishes because the church would have to be constructed on a cranberry bog. The land was donated by James Hart Welch, son of clockmaker Elijah Welch. The cornerstone was laid in January of 1892, but the church was not completed until 5 years later because of a national economic downturn. Masses were held in the basement for 5 years. It remained a mission church of Our Lady of Mercy until 1918, when it became a self-sufficient parish. At one point, St. Matthew's bought land on Louisiana Avenue I believe this is where Stafford School is presently located, in hopes of building a larger church. This was sold when it was determined that the bishop was going to subdivide the parish. In 1961, the parish erected a school, which is still very active today. St. Matthew's built a new church in the latter part of the 1980s. The parish at that point was host to over 3,000 families. The St. Matthew parish, unfortunately, has had an unusual dose of sadness thrust upon it suddenly. In 1939, when parishioners showed up for Mass, they found out the Reverend James T. McDonald passed away unexpectedly during the night. In 1999, the Reverend Robert Lish was bludgeoned to death in the sacristy of the church, and parishioners found him when they came to worship. More recently, in 2010, the beloved pastor, Reverend Brian Monarat of Waterbury, died while vacationing in Bermuda. As immigration continued to increase, both St. Joseph's and St. Matthew churches included numerous French-Canadian, Italian, and Polish parishioners. Although appreciative of the services provided, they felt a desire to form churches of their own, in which priests could conduct worship services in their native languages. They had brought with them their own customs, traditions, religious heritage, and even thought processes. They felt these would be best expressed and maintained in the context of their own language and church. This would also afford the opportunity to socialize with people with similar interests. The people of French descent were the first to found their own parish in 1907. The Reverend Joseph Perot would assume the leadership in the development of the St. Anne's Roman Catholic Church. The first Mass was conducted at the Old Town Hall, known as Crenolan Hall, in November of that year. Mass was later celebrated on the second floor of the J. H. Sessions Company on North Main Street. The Polish-speaking community had been planning to form their own church since 1912. In 1918, this became a reality. Reverend George Bartlewski, a Polish-speaking priest, was appointed as his first pastor in 1919, after only serving 4 years in the priesthood. He was able to secure, only 1 week after he arrived, the Old Town Hall as a place to conduct services. The first Mass was celebrated on April 27, 1919, at which time there were 200 Polish families. Land for the church and rectory on West Street were secured for $7,800. Construction of a basement church commenced, and 6 months later the entire debt was paid off. This was a characteristic of this parish. Whenever finances were needed, the members of the church eagerly contributed and raised the necessary funds. The basement church would cost $40,000. The cornerstone was laid in 1920, and in December of the same year, the first services were held. A parochial school at a cost of $109,000 was constructed in 1930, and despite the Great Depression, the entire debt was paid off by 1941. 500 members of the St. Stanislaus Parish entered the service of the country during World War II. Captain Edmund Zibikowski, a teacher at Bristol High School, was the first Bristolite to pay the supreme sacrifice. By 1954, with $400,000 in the treasury, construction of a more modern church began. The school auditorium served as a temporary church. The new church would be built on the same location as the basement church and was dedicated on May 20th, 1956. Reverend Bartlewski retired at the beginning of 1968 after nearly one-half century of service to St. Stanislaus Parish. The Italians arrived in the Bristol area starting in the late 1800s. Their adjustment was hindered by illiteracy and the inability to speak or understand English. Everyday happenings seemed foreign to them. They lived in close proximity to each other as a source of support. It was certainly not unexpected that they petitioned for and became incorporated as a parish in 1920. The Reverend Luigi Beccaris, the founding pastor, was engaged on November 30th. The first Mass was said on Sunday, December 19th of that year. Their first church would be utilized for the next 10 years. With a growth in population, local contractor Cosmo Baca was hired to construct a new church, which was dedicated in the fall of 1930. In 1928, an order of sisters had been contracted, but were sent away because of the Great Depression. In 1935, the Filipini sisters were hired and are still located at St. Anthony. Reverend Crudele became the third pastor in 1938 and remained with St. Anthony's for 32 years. He started the St. Anthony's Elementary School in the old church in September 1939. The school conducted classes for grades 1 through 9. In 1950, he purchased the old Veeder Root Factory near Brackett Park and opened a high school with 20 sophomores in September of that year. This school closed in June of 1967 with the opening of St. Paul Catholic High School. A total of 930 graduates, as well as many excellent students and athletes, passed through its doors in 18 years. Since Crudele's death in 1972, a team ministry or co-pastorate has been established. St. Gregory's the Great Roman Catholic Parish was the final Catholic church to be established in Bristol. The St. Matthew's Church was subdivided in November 1957, with Reverend Charles McNerney becoming its first pastor. Services were first held at Stafford School until a beautiful church was completed. St. Gregory's is the only Catholic church never to establish a school. The Bristol landscape in the past and now is dotted with a diversity of churches serving a variety of needs. The Jewish population was not sufficiently large enough to form a synagogue until 1924, when they purchased a house directly across from the Bristol Boys Club and remodeled it to accommodate services and also to serve as the rabbi's home. In 1928, they purchased land for a cemetery on Lake Avenue to be known as the Beth Israel Cemetery. Land from the Brightwood estate was acquired and the Beth Israel Synagogue was dedicated in 1948. The Bristol Salvation Army was formed in 1912. They moved around town for a number of years. In 1963, they took over the former Lebanon Church. This now serves as their citadel. They continue to meet the spiritual needs and the social outreach needs within the community. The Christian Science Society was organized in 1919. At the beginning, they met at various halls, but acquired the Newell homestead on High Street and remodeled it to meet their needs. In 1964, a new Christian Science church on King Street was dedicated. This could only be dedicated when it was debt-free. Several churches within our city continue to meet the ethnic needs of our community. The Star of Jacob Church, serving the needs of mainly a Hispanic population, is located in the old Swedish Congregational Church on Queen Street. The AME Zion Church, located on Circle Street in Forestville, services the needs of some of our community's Afro-American population. The St. Demetrius Greek Orthodox Church is located on the former Brightwood Estate off of West Street. This services the Eastern Rite population. Kingdom Hall, belonging to the Jehovah's Witness faith, is now located on Jerome Avenue after many years on South Street. The Islamic community practices their religious faith at a facility near the western end of Route 6. Several non-denominational churches or assemblies are located within our city. These churches bring together people in Christian fellowship. Oftentimes, informal gatherings are conducted rather than formal, constricted religious services. Bible and scripture readings provide a great deal of illumination. All people are free to participate and simply meet as Christians to understand their relationship with God and to outreach to the community. The last two groups to be discussed are the Swedish and German Lutherans. As will be seen, the German Lutherans have experienced controversy throughout most of their existence. The Swedish immigrant population was the first non-speaking population to arrive through Ellis Island. They settled in the Forestville section of Bristol and established a small church in 1890. It would be called the Bethesda Lutheran Church. They would later build a larger church next door. This was dedicated in 1907. The people traveling from Bristol to this church were known as the Swedish Parade. They would build their own church, the Lebanon Lutheran Church. The first service was held in 1892. These two churches were jointly served for half a century until 1947 by the same pastor. They then became independent churches with their own pastor. Both churches in the early 1960s were looking to build larger facilities. After a series of meetings, they decided to merge to become the Gloria Dei Lutheran Church. The first service took place on Christmas Eve, 1963. The Swedish in Forestville and Plainville also established a Swedish Congregational Church on Camp Street. In 1942, the entire church was destroyed by a tornado. The Emmanuel Lutheran Evangelical Church was organized with Reverend Wilhelm Brend as pastor in August of 1892. A small church was built, but as the population grew, it was replaced with a larger one in 1894. This stood at the corner of Orchard and School Streets. When the controversy was settled by court action, Brend resigned. Parishioners also left the congregation and attended church in New Britain. They would return to form the Zion Lutheran Evangelical Church in 1902. The Reverend Otto Dissel was installed in 1895 as pastor. He worked tirelessly until his death in 1925. The Emmanuel Lutheran Parish was associated with the Missouri Synod in 1897. Pastor Dissel was also the pastor of the Holy Trinity Church in Terryville. He attempted to keep his position there when they decided to become an independent church. He lost the court battle that ensued. Land for a new church was purchased in 1902. The church was finished in 1907 after financing could be arranged. A school had been started in 1898 and was active in several different locations. In 1924, the first of two schools was constructed. The names of Herbert Kern, Oscar Wolf, and Vernon Koch will be recognized as playing significant roles in the school history. A new school and gymnasium would be constructed in the 1960s. The Reverend Robert Rydell accepted the call to be pastor in 1961. He left to become an administrator with the Missouri Synod. A controversy arose in 1970 while he was in administrative role between the conservative and liberal elements of the Missouri Synod. This would split the Missouri Synod and also the church in Bristol. Reverend Ron Jackson left Emmanuel Lutheran and became pastor of the newly formed Covenant Lutheran Church. They met at either Stafford School or at the Barnes Memorial Chapel. The Bethlehem Lutheran Church had been established as a mission church of Emmanuel Lutheran. They built a small church on Farmington Avenue. Reverend George Meyer, pastor of Emmanuel Lutheran, served as their first pastor. They would later construct a new church on Stafford Avenue and merge with the Covenant Church for financial reasons.